Hey, everybody. Welcome to Aging Insight. I'm John Ross, all by myself today, getting ready to start the show live here on Facebook and live on the radio. So here's the opening music for all of your listening pleasure. Hope you enjoy the show today.
Where?
The following program offers general advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship. Every person's legal situation is unique. You should contact your attorney before taking any legal action related to the subjects discussed in this program. Welcome to Aging Insight, the only show dedicated to your elder care concerns and your resource for learning about how to manage your health, housing, financial, and legal needs. This is a live call-in program featuring John Ross and Lisa Schollmeyer, elder law attorneys and senior advocates for the Art LaTex.
Should be interesting.
Aging Insight is dedicated to helping you navigate the challenges and blessing of growing older. So call in and ask your questions. The number is 903-793-1071. Now here are your hosts, John Ross and Lisa Schollmeyer.
Welcome to Aging Insight, everybody. This is your host, John Ross, here live in the studio today. I am all by my lonesome here in the studio, so you're stuck with my voice for the next hour of your listening pleasure. As I mentioned, normally the show here with John Ross and Lisa Schollmeyer, but Lisa out in Shreveport this morning competing in a 5K. I believe she did finish it, did a good job. She's just not back yet. So you've got me, and I've got a really interesting topic today. Should be a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy it. Do want to give a shout out to all of our sponsors. You know, you can check us out on Facebook, where I've got links to all of those sponsors, but I always like to give them a shout out here on the show. So special thanks to Dirksen Memorial Hospice, Edgewood Manor Nursing and Rehab, the Barnett Agency, Cowhorn Creek Estates, Texarkana Funeral Home, Red River Credit Union, Reunion Plaza, and Heritage Plaza, both of those skilled nursing facilities here in town. And great, all of these are great services. If you're out in the community, if you're dealing with one of these agencies, or if you know somebody that works with them, and you listen to the show, be sure and let them know, just so that they know that that this message is getting out there to the people. They sponsor the show because they know this information is important and a little bit entertaining. We get to come in and talk about whatever we want. And so on a day like today, I get to talk about something interesting, and, you'll learn a little something, but mostly just kind of a strange little situation. Now, before I get into all of that, we've got lots of things coming up professionally. Lisa and I, we do a lot of community programs around Texarkana and around the surrounding areas. And our law school lunch is coming up on January 24th here in Texarkana. That's over at the Texarkana Convention Center. It's free to anybody who wants to attend. However, we do ask that you give us a shout over at the office. That phone number is 903-223-5653. And let us know you're coming. That way we know that how many plates of food to order, because it is lunch. It is a free lunch, and lots of good information. This month on the January 24th, Lisa will be speaking on guardianship versus power of attorney. That's something that you really need to know about, especially if maybe you have that family member, or maybe you yourself have been hesitant about getting powers of attorney in place. I know I've said it on the show about 1,000 times that if you're 18 or above, you should already have powers of attorney in place. But often people don't. They're hesitant. They don't understand it necessarily. I just had some folks in the office this week that had powers of attorney, but actually didn't understand what they were. That they had just, anyway, it doesn't matter. But when you compare power of attorney to guardianship, these are the two ways that you can help an incapacitated person when they become incapacitated. And one is so much simpler, so much easier, and so much cheaper. It just doesn't make any sense one way or the other. So, and there are, of course, alternatives to both of them. But you really ought to go check out that program. And you're not doing anything for lunch anyway, except eating, and you might as well eat for free. So Texarkana Convention Center, January 24th. Come on over. That's, of course, we'll start right at lunch and try to get done right at 1 o'clock. So, all right. Today we're going to be talking about the estate tax, but not directly. And that's because I've kind of got a weird little story here to start out with. And this all goes back to a woman named Janine Louis Calment. And I guarantee I am pronouncing this wrong, because Jean Calment is French. And so it's probably Jean Calmet or something like that, but I ain't French. And we don't have Lisa on the show to correct me. So here we go with me butchering some French names. But if you don't recognize the name Jean Calment, again, French woman, currently holds the world record as the oldest human ever. Yeah. She is one of the few what they call super centenarians. Those are people who have lived beyond the age of 110. And she got way past 110. She died in August of 1997 at the age of 122 and 164 days. So about 122 and a half. And that makes it a world record. She was from Marlise, France, born February 21st, 1875. Wow. Yeah, you know, I mean, 97, heck, she was just 3 years away from crossing, spanning 2-century marks. So pretty unusual for somebody to, you know, and I've had some older clients. I've had one super centenarian. I've had one person over 110. I've had several over the years that have been 100 and above. And then, of course, these days, just being over 90, between 90 and 100, frankly, is just not that rare anymore. Even being over 100 these days is getting less and less rare as life expectancies have increased over the years. And so, you know, it's not uncommon to see folks live well into their 90s. Some of those cross that 100 barrier. It is still exceptionally rare to see somebody cross the 110 barrier. And I didn't research this before the show, but it's dang near, it's got to be dang near impossible to cross the 120 mark. And yet, supposedly, Jean Calment did cross this mark. Now, that's the longest confirmed human lifespan. That's the oldest living person up until that time. The only, and here I'm looking at Wikipedia now, so take anything that I say for granted. I'm pulling it off the internet. The only person verified to live to 120 or beyond. So there you go. And she was the first person verified to live to 116. And so, you know, since 1997, and I guess really even before that, as she started crossing these other thresholds, she actually became somewhat of a celebrity in older life because of, because of this age. People wanted to visit with her, they wanted to see her, and that sort of stuff. She did have a family. Again, she was born in Arles, France. She had a daughter named Yvonne, and she had married. She actually had married her double second cousin, Ferdinand Nicholas Calmet or Calmet. I don't know how you say it. I'm going to go with Calmet. Yeah, so she had married her second cousin, which, I think in the late 1800s, this is, basically this is Victorian era France. So I don't know that was all that unusual. Did have, like I said, they did have this child, Yvonne, and, when you live that long, you can outlive lots of family members. Her and Ferdinand, they only had the one daughter, Yvonne, and according to the records, Yvonne actually died all the way back in 1934. So here, Yvonne, we've got Jean, who born in 1875, has this daughter Yvonne, but and Jean supposedly didn't die all the way until 1997, but outlived her daughter by dang near 65 years. And that's kind of crazy. That was their only child. Although Yvonne did have a child. So why am I telling you all of this? So what is so interesting about all of this? Well, the question is she legitimate? Because there has been some research now that maybe Jean here is a fraud. For those of you who are listening live on the radio, if you'll go to Facebook and check us out on Facebook, I'm throwing up some pictures here of Jean. I've got a picture up here of a very, very aged Jean. And again, having visited with folks who are in their 90s, in their hundreds, certainly, age does take its toll. And so this picture, I don't know when this picture exactly was taken, but it looks like a person who is probably very old, maybe in their late 90s or even early hundreds. I don't know if she looks 120 because I've never seen anybody that looks 120, so I can't say for sure. But here recently, there was a Russian genealogist, and I don't know how he got on this, but he decided he was going to start looking into this business of her being the oldest person. And I guess maybe he just didn't believe it. And so he started doing some research. He started looking at some photos. In these days, we talked about on the show last week with the ancestry.com and all of this stuff that you can pull up, and there's family photos, and there's all kinds of things now that have been uploaded and are available on the internet. He did all kinds of things. He looked up stuff, and he basically came up with the idea that maybe this Jean here was not Jean. That maybe Jean had actually died all the way back in 1935. Now, what's significant about that? That's the day that the daughter supposedly died. Yeah. And so what his proposition is that what actually happened was that Jean, the real Jean, died back in the 1930s, and that the daughter, Yvonne, took her identity and then lived as her mother from that point forward. Which, if true, means that Jean was not really Jean, but Jean was Yvonne. Still obviously lived a large life, lived a long time, but no 122 years as it is claimed. The question is, why in the world would a daughter claim the identity of her mother and then live the remainder of her life as if she were that person? Well, the answer to that question coming up here in just a second. Gonna have to take me a quick break. Stick around.
To Aging Insight, call
Oh, excuse me. All right, so yes, this is Jean here on. You've got her on the screen there. These here, supposedly the person on the top there in this picture is Jean, and this picture was taken, I don't know when. The picture below is the daughter Yvonne. So the question is, which one is the real one? Which one of these two eventually became this one? and now, some of this has become a bit of a conspiracy theory, and there are some people, one thing the internet does is, boy, does it dive into these sort of topics. And there's been several articles that I've read this morning on this, talking about, comparing ear structure and nose structure and all kinds of other stuff. I'm not going to get into all of that. But it is interesting, and I will say they make some pretty good arguments about it. Now, the only thing in all of this that supposedly when they were awarding her all of these things about being the oldest person, they actually did research this quite a bit. But if you think about it, what kind of records do we really have going all the way back? How much real information did they have? In 2018 or 2019, with all the technology we have, people can still steal your identity in a heartbeat and live like you. And they can get a driver's license, and they can get birth certificates, and they can get all kinds of stuff and pretend like they're you, but off and on. So if somebody can do it, given all of the technology that we have now, certainly seems like it would have been a whole lot easier to do it back in 1930s. Pretty interesting. Now, whether or not this is the real deal, who knows? I don't know. But you've got to certainly ask yourself, why would somebody do this? Well, I've seen a bunch of crazy stuff, particularly in the context of probates. People die, people change. And, whether they're fighting over a stupid sewing machine or a daddy's watch or $1 million in the bank, it really doesn't matter the value. It doesn't matter the item. If people are going to fight, they're going to fight. And when they fight, it's amazing the kind of lengths that they will go to. But it's that blood and that money, one way or the other. So, all right, we're about to go back live.
1071. Now back to Aging Insight with John and Lisa.
Welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. This is your host, John Ross, here back in the studio. And today I've been talking about this lady, Jean Calment, or Calment, I don't know how you say it, who is on record as being the oldest living human, lived to 122, died in 1997. And yet this Russian researcher has proposed that maybe, just maybe, the Janine that we all knew as the oldest person is not really Jean, but in fact her daughter Yvonne, who supposedly died in 1935. So why would a daughter take over the identity of her mother at this time frame? Well, a couple of things going on back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, particularly in the early 1900s. And again, remember, she lived in France, right? France, coming around 1930, they had just finished up a little war over there, a little world war that happened over there in France. And this was catastrophic to the French economy. Frankly, it was catastrophic to the economies across Europe. On a side note, if you have not seen the World War I documentary, came out to the theaters for just one day. I believe it is going to come out again, maybe in January or February. It's done by Peter Jackson. So recolorization of old World War I footage. If you haven't seen this thing, you have got to see it. It's fantastic. But anyway, World War I has ravaged the economies of these countries, and the countries themselves, they need money. And they weren't the only ones. The United States also in the late or early 1900s, in fact, around 1916 to be specific, also needed some money coming out of World War I. And they were looking around, trying to figure out where they could get some money for the government coffers. And they decided, you know what? What about all these people that have accumulated some money and are dying, maybe we should tax them at death. And so you get the inheritance tax. The first time the inheritance tax reared its ugly head in the United States was 1916. They had tried a couple of times before then in the late 1800s with the Civil War, but primarily the real incarnation of the estate tax in the United States started in 1916. I haven't researched it in France as far as when it started and all of that. What I do know is that there was, in fact, an estate tax in 1935 or whenever it was that Yvonne, the daughter, supposedly died. Now, this estate tax, and I did have to do a little research on this just to kind of figure out a few things. You know, in the United States, if you die and you have a spouse and you leave everything to your spouse, there is no estate tax. Okay? So I don't care if you're Bill Gates or Elon Musk or any of those billionaire types. If you die and you leave everything to your spouse, there's what's called the unlimited marital deduction. And so there's never an estate tax on the death of the first spouse to die. But this is specific to the United States. Apparently, in the early 1900s in France, the estate tax, which was give or take about 35%, applied even if you left a surviving spouse. So think about it. You know, you've got a husband and wife, and they've got, let's say they've got a net worth of $100,000. And, you know, that probably includes their home and whatever savings and cars and everything. So they've got a net worth of $100,000. And one of those spouses dies. The way the French government, based on what I've read, the way the French government did it is they would tax the total value of the marital estate when that first spouse died at a tax rate of 35%. So, you know, imagine losing 35% of your net worth because your spouse died. And that's pretty harsh. I mean, that is a harsh tax scheme. Certainly not anything you would see in the United States, even back in the early 1900s. But this is the way it was in France. And I mentioned earlier that Jean here, she was married to Ferdinand. Ferdinand had actually become a relatively successful businessman. He had a business. He had employees. He had actually done pretty well for himself. So think about it. He's got a valuable business. If he's done well for himself, he's probably got a few bucks in the bank. He's got a little money. And now, let's just say that his wife died. Let's say that the real Jean actually died in 1935. And you're Ferdinand. And you are sitting there looking at a 35% tax. And I bet that 35% tax was probably more than his liquid assets, especially if he owned a business, right? If he owns a business, he might be what we call land rich and cash poor, right? He's got his building, he's got his inventory, and yeah, there's value there, but that's not liquid value that you can just turn into cash and pay 35% over to the government. And so Ferdinand, I'm thinking, okay, Ferdinand's sitting there going, wait a second now, I'm about to lose, just because my wife died, I'm about to lose 35% of my net worth. I got to come up with a solution here. And maybe as he's coming up with that solution, he looks over at his young daughter who just bears such a striking resemblance to his wife. And maybe they come up with the grand scheme of switching those identities. That's the theory. All right, we're going to talk about this more when we come back and a few other weird things. So stick around. We'll be back.
PFS, home of the Glenn Beck program.
All right, so that's the idea here. And I'll go more into it on the radio here in a second once we get back live. But yeah, the theory here is that basically Ferdinand gets his daughter Yvonne to take over Jean's identity, because if the daughter dies, hey, daughter doesn't own anything, right? No estate tax. But if the wife, Jean, dies, 35% of the whole marital estate. That's huge. So all they got to do then, and again, think about this. This is, I mean, we're not talking about, you got to take yourself out of the modern day and go back to 1935. We're not talking about big medical exams and all of that sort of stuff. They don't have everybody's DNA and fingerprints and everything on file with every other people. There's no Alexa listening to you at the house while you talk. You know, all this is probably just some paper shuffling one way or the other. You know, there's probably no medical examiners being involved. You know, somebody dies in the home, and I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing in France, somebody dies in the home in 1935. Maybe you probably call your local church and the pastor, and they start making arrangements to have somebody come over, and you have a funeral, and you have a casket, and the person's put in the casket, and off they go. And you know, if you did that right, especially if you know, maybe you threw a few bucks one way or the other to let somebody just, you know, not quite pay attention or whatever it is, yeah, you might could have just done it. Now, I don't know if that's what happened here, but if you go back to some of these pictures here, the person in the bottom picture, I've actually got a better picture there for that one. This is a colorized version of that bottom picture. This is the daughter here, right? This is the daughter, the one. This is Yvonne, the one that supposedly died. And if you look at her, and supposedly in this picture right here, supposedly in this picture, which has later been actually attributed to being not Yvonne, but Jean. This picture right here was supposedly taken in the late 1800s, but the style of haircut there, that bob haircut, that's a very Great Gatsby's, that's some 1920s haircut. And the real Janine would have been much older than this at in the 1930s. Also, if you look at her facial structure there, you compare that, say, to the older, and you can see some similarities there. And again, if you really want to play into it, you can get online. You can check out some of this stuff online, and where they actually have old photos and they're comparing the ear structure and the nose and the chin and things like that. The evidence seems pretty good. I think a lot of people are dismissing it as just a conspiracy theory. I don't know, but it certainly is compelling. All right, let's see. We still have about, I think another 30 seconds before I'm having to go back live on the internet. Get me a drink here. I appreciate everybody watching the show. Now, the estate tax, it actually started in 1916. It's been around ever since in one form or the other. It has wavered up and down. We did have 2010, 1 year where there was no estate tax, but it came roaring back in 2011 and has been with us ever since. So, the estate tax has been around for a long time. And, you know, tax is a motivator. One of the reasons that they use tax policy is to get the population to do things that they want them to do. So we know tax is a motivator. All right. I'm about to go live in about 5 seconds. So here we go.
Have a question? Phone 903-793-1071. Now back to Aging Insight with John and Lisa.
Welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. This is your host, John Ross, here live in the studio. And today I'm talking about, I've been talking about Jean Calment, or Calmet, who is the oldest living person, maybe. And the reason I say maybe is because supposedly Jean's daughter died in 1935 at a time in France where if a spouse died, the surviving spouse basically lost 35% of their net worth to the French government because of a death tax. And so some research has been done, and the theory now, at least among some circles, is that it was actually Janine, the mother, Janine died in 1935, that the surviving husband, Ferdinand, knowing that this would cause a 35% death tax that would probably crush his successful business and empty out their savings, the theory is that he gets his daughter Yvonne to take over the identity of his wife and then live as Jean for the remainder of her years. If true, then basically Yvonne lived as Jean for almost 100 years, because if this really is Yvonne, she lived all the way up until 1997. And so, when Jean would have been 122, if that's what happened. Of course, we don't know, but they are pushing now. There's some interest in actually maybe pulling up the bodies, doing some DNA work. Our science is a lot better now, and we can probably actually figure out some of these things by pulling those bodies up and doing some DNA testing. So who knows what actually happened here? What I do know is that the tax is a motivator. Taxes have always been a motivator. I hear people a lot of times, I started out as a tax attorney, so I've got quite a bit of background in taxation, got a degree in accounting, know quite a bit about taxes. I'm not I'm not a practicing CPA. I don't do people's taxes and stuff like that, but I'm pretty familiar with it, particularly with the estate tax. Done a lot of work with the estate tax over the years. But, from a tax policy standpoint, the government uses taxes to motivate people to do things. This is why you have a mortgage interest deduction. The government thinks that it's good for the economy if people buy houses. So they incentivize that by having a tax break. If you buy a house, you get a mortgage for that house, then you're going to get a tax deduction, because they know that tax motivates people to do things. But it can also work the other way, right? It can motivate people to try to avoid tax to the extremes. And one of the comments on the Facebook, taxes equal control. That's certainly very, that's exactly right. The government can use the tax policy to motivate people to do things. I mean, that was the whole idea behind the Obamacare, right? We were going to have a tax, but if you don't get the health insurance, then you're going to have to pay a penalty, right? This is theoretically, we're using that tax policy to motivate you to purchase the insurance. We're going to give you a charitable deduction, right? We're trying to motivate you to make charitable donations so that you can pay less in taxes. This is one of the reasons why I've often said that things like a flat tax, the reason that they don't work, it's not that in theory they work great. The reason that they never actually could happen is not because it wouldn't work. It's because the lobbying from the banking for mortgage interest deductions, the lobbying from churches and other nonprofit organizations that rely heavily on charitable donations. If you do something like a flat tax, there's no tax incentive to use a bank to get a mortgage to buy a house. There's no tax incentive to make a donation to a charity. And a lot of the very, very big charitable donations are in fact tax motivated. That's just the way it is. I've done several estate plans where my client said, hey, the only thing I care about is that when I die, the government doesn't get none of my money. Hey, that's fine. My next question to them was, well, do you have any charitable intentions? And when they said yes, hey, they said, yeah, I really support, the Alzheimer's Alliance, or I really support opportunities, or whatever it is. Then we can set up so that they get a charitable deduction at their death to avoid paying death taxes. So we know tax policy does motivate people. This is one of the, if this is true, and if they do dig up these bodies and do the DNA test, this has got to be one of the most extreme tax dodging schemes I can possibly think of. Taking over a parent's identity and then living as that person for dang near a century. And then imagine if that really is the case. And imagine you're Yvonne pretending to be Jean. You're now up into your 90s and hundreds. And yeah, or maybe you're in your 70s and 80s, but everybody thinks you're in your 90s and your hundreds. And as you start getting into that 110 range, and you're starting to get all this publicity, and people want to talk to you about how old you are, and people are researching it. Can you imagine if that really is the case? Trying to keep all of that secret hidden inside of you when you're getting all this publicity. People are inviting you to be on TV shows and all kinds of stuff. Really kind of a crazy concept. And I'm just not sure that she could have really done it. I mean, I can see doing it in 1935, and I can see getting a couple of years down the road. But what I have a hard time thinking that this lady just kept that going, unless maybe just her ego, right? Maybe when all of that publicity was coming in and all of that attention was coming in, maybe she just appreciated the attention so much she held the secret to herself and kept going with it. Well, as I was reading about this particular tax fraud scheme for the death tax, I actually came across several others, and so I think I'm gonna take a break, so I'll have enough time to mention a couple of these others, because when it comes to the death tax, people really don't like it, and they really want to get out from under it. And so I've got a couple of stories for you. So stick around. We'll be right back. All right, now I'm off on the break there. I think this is a weird story. I really do. It's a strange bunch. I really don't know if it's true. There's an article on Medium, medium.com. There's actually two articles that go into depth on this, comparing the ear structure and things like that. When you look at it, it's actually very compelling. You can see here, I don't know if you can see it in this picture here, but that's that same picture I showed you earlier up there in the top corner of Yvonne, and then down there in the bottom, that's Janine as a middle-aged person, and then Janine as an older person, and the facial structure in all three of them looks very, very similar. So I don't know if that's really the deal. Could be. I don't know if I would have thought about. I don't know that I would have had the cojones necessarily to pull off something like that to get out of the estate tax. I'm certainly one to take advantage of every opportunity I can to save a tax dollar. In fact, there's a Supreme Court case where one of the Supreme Court justices said that it is not only a right, but it's your obligation as a taxpayer to pay the absolute minimum that you are required to pay, not $1 more. That's your obligation as a taxpayer, to pay as little as possible. And I think that's right? The government's not there to tax you more than what, whatever the tax is, that's what you pay. And so if you've got available deductions, yeah, and you can push the limits, right now, particularly right now, the government's shut down, so ain't nobody getting audited. And they certainly could, but even when the government's up and running, the chances of being audited are actually very low, one in several thousand. And interestingly enough, because of budgetary cuts, the people that are most likely to be audited are actually not the very wealthy. The very wealthy are not getting the very wealthy are not getting audited, frankly, because they can put up too much of a defense. So most of the audits that are happening right now are more middle income folks. All right, back on the show for our last segment. Here we go.
Question, phone 903-793-1071. Now back to Aging Insight with John and Lisa.
Well, welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. This is your host, John Ross, here live in the studio. And today we're talking about some odd tax situation where at least the theory here is that a woman named Jean Calmette, who is noted as the oldest living person, dying at 122, actually may have died in 1935, and her daughter, who was named Yvonne, actually ended up taking her identity, living as her for the rest of her life, and all because in France they taxed the estate when a first spouse died, and that's a pretty big motivator. Now, like I said, I was researching some of this, and I came up with a couple of others that I thought were pretty funny. Going back to the American estate tax, I mentioned earlier that it does not matter how much you have. We have what they call an unlimited marital deduction. Unlimited, which means you can be Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, the current richest man around. I think his net worth's $100 billion or some god awful number like that. So Jeff Bezos, $100 billion with a B, $billion, and at his death, if he left every penny to his wife, there would be no death tax, right? Unlimited marital deduction. So, for example, one of the things that I read was it was actually in Ireland, and Ireland has a similar situation where you have an unlimited marital deduction. And these two gentlemen in Ireland, both successful businessmen, also both bachelors. So they're both bachelors, they're aging men, and I didn't really get into quite all the details, but maybe their wives had already died, but they're aging, and so they basically got the bright idea that they would just get married themselves. This is two heterosexual individuals who entered into a same-sex marriage for the sole purpose of taking advantage of the unlimited marital deduction. And the interesting thing is the unlimited marital deduction, it applies to your spouse. So if you did it right, if Jeff Bezos were to die and leave everything to his wife, and then his wife were to remarry and leave everything to that person, they could continue to do this on and on and on, theoretically in perpetuity, as long as they did it correctly, and nobody would ever pay a dime of estate tax because of this unlimited marital deduction. And now that you're seeing things like same-sex marriage, you're not even limited to the gender of the person that you get involved with here. So, and that has already happened. So we're already seeing same-sex marriages for heterosexual couples who are doing it for purposes of the estate tax. Another one I read, and this was actually in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a state estate tax. Okay, Texas doesn't have a state estate tax. Neither does Louisiana. Neither does Oklahoma. Neither does Arkansas. So all of my current listening area on the radio, at least, we don't have to worry about a state level estate tax, but Pennsylvania does. And in Pennsylvania, if you leave your assets to a child, then there is a 10% tax. But if you leave it to anybody who's not a child, so if you leave it to a friend or a buddy or a pal, or maybe probably even grandchildren or great-grandchildren, if I were guessing, if you leave it to anybody but the child, it's actually like a 20 or 30% tax. So it's much higher. And so, that would make sense then. If you're going to leave everything to a child, you get a better tax break. Now, in the Pennsylvania case, it was actually a gay couple. The two gentlemen, one actually considerably older than the other, but two adult men in a consenting relationship. And the older gentleman, recognizing that Pennsylvania has this state tax that is beneficial if you leave everything to a child, well, being kind of a planning guy, apparently he adopted his partner. So instead of getting married, and my guess is, and I didn't look at the time frame, but my guess is this was probably several years ago, before the same-sex marriage had pretty much come across as being permitted just about everywhere. So probably marrying his same-sex partner was not an option. So instead, he adopts him. Many people don't know this, but you can adopt an adult. It does not matter how old they are. Even in my own practice, I have done an adoption of a 90-year-old person adopting a person who's in their 60s. You can adopt anybody at any age. There's no dynamics there. They can be older than you, can be younger. It doesn't matter. So you can do adult adoptions. And so in this case, they did an adult adoption because this guy obviously wanted to leave everything to his companion. Problem is, his companion, not a child, and couldn't at the time be a spouse. So what was the alternative? Do the adoption, and that cut the tax rate down to 10%. So, it just goes to show you that it doesn't matter what the situation is. If you create a tax, somebody's probably going to try to find a way to get out from under that tax. And the more abhorrent the tax is, the harder people are going to try to get out from under it. And I would say one of the things that people generally, a lot of people do not care for the estate tax. For most people currently in the United States, you have to have an estate valued at over $11.2 million to have to worry about the estate tax. I still get clients coming into the office that say, John, we're worried that when we die, the government's going to get all of our stuff, or somebody's going to have to pay a big tax bill. Rarely are these folks in an actual taxable bracket. You've got to have a net worth of over 11.2 million, and that's per person, right? So with a married couple, one spouse can leave everything to their other spouse, so there's no tax there. And they have a thing now where that first spouse's estate tax exemption, that 11.2 million, you can file a little form so that the surviving spouse gets that exemption plus their own exemption. So for most married couples right now, they can pass up to $22.4 million without having to worry about anybody paying tax. And notice the estate tax is actually paid by the estate. It's paid before it ever goes to the heirs. The heirs do not pay tax on the receipt of an inheritance. So receipt of an inheritance is generally tax-free. You don't have to worry about that. I say generally because there are some exceptions. Things like IRAs where the money has not been taxed, those are going to get taxed at some point. So if you still have money in an IRA when you die and it goes to the kids, they're gonna have to pay tax on that. Maybe not all at once. They may be able to roll it over into an inherited IRA or something like that in order to stretch out the tax. But otherwise, if you leave your house to your kids, you leave your bank accounts to your kids, your cars, your paintings, your CDs, your stocks and bonds, your mineral rights, your timberland, all of these things are going to go to your beneficiaries tax-free. And unless the total value of all of that exceeds 11.2 million for a single person, you're just not gonna, there's no tax here. This is completely tax neutral. And so that actually only applies to about the wealthiest 0.0002% of the population. That's a tiny little portion. There's probably just in my radio listening area, there's probably less than a handful, probably less than a dozen people that would have to worry about the estate tax at this level. And yet, still, universally, people are pretty much against it. And I get it, because you know what? When you made that money, you paid tax on it. And it just doesn't seem right to pay it again. And the other thing is it's easy. I think the people that support the estate tax, they think of it in the terms of, well, geez, if you've got $15 million in the bank, well, then you can afford to pay a couple of $1 million in taxes at death. Well, yeah, if you've got $15 million in the bank. But a lot of people that have that kind of net worth don't have $15 million in the bank. I had a client in Lamar County, Texas, who owned a farm in Illinois, soybean farm, and the value of that farm alone was $13 million. It produced a nice little revenue for him. I mean, it was a good living. He made $250,000 a year net income off of his farming soybean farms up in Illinois. But that's more than 11 million. And so if you're going to tax that, where's the money going to come from? That's not cash. That's dirt. That's soybeans. And in fact, half the time it's half-grown soybeans. So it doesn't really work. And so I think the people that get it, particularly our rural folks, our Texas folks, Arkansas folks, we see value in things that are not cash, in land, in timber, in minerals, in farms. That's where we see a lot of our wealth. When you get into some of the bigger cities and things, and they see wealth in the forms of stocks that can be easily turned into cash. So anyway, hope you enjoyed my interesting story about Jean Calmette, whether or not she really is Jean Calmette, or whether she spent 100 years pretending to be her mom, whether it was Yvonne Calmette pretending to be her mom for 100 years. And why? Just to get out of the France death tax. Pretty interesting story. Feel free to get on the internet, check it out. Check us out on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, give us a like. You can share the video if you thought it was interesting. And stay tuned for upcoming live presentations. Our law school lunches and things like that are all starting up again this year. So look for us in the newspaper and out in the community. We'll see you next time. And we will see all of y'all again. I appreciate you watching. Thanks.